The Occoquan Radio Podcast is a private production and is not affiliated with the town of Occoquan. Opinions expressed on the podcast are solely those of its host and guests. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Occoquan Radio Podcast. I'm your host, Ernie Porta, bringing you 10 to 15 minutes every week of irregular, unscheduled updates on things Occoquan and beyond. This week on the podcast, we'll cover some upcoming and past town business, discuss what English novelist John Davis really thought about Occoquan in 1801, address some confusion about Occoquan's first school, and close by reviewing upcoming activities in town. I'm pleased to report that we are also now available on Apple Podcasts, as well as a host of other platforms. Make sure you don't miss an episode by searching for us on the podcasting platform of your choice and hitting the subscribe button. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy this episode of the Occoquan Radio Podcast. The main item of business at the next council meeting is a preliminary discussion of the proposed fiscal year 2026 budget for the town's general fund and events fund. Those who are interested can view the relevant documents on the town's official website, www.occoquanva.gov. I also want to mention this week some past town business about which questions periodically arise. My plan is to address groups of these each week as a way of updating the community on some past activities. This week I'm going to discuss 3 that occurred back in May and June of 2022. If you walk through Rivermill Park, you will almost certainly notice a bench swing. This wonderful addition to the park was dedicated in June of 2022 in memory of late Occoquan resident Petra Casapit. Petra had passed away in December of 2021 after a brief illness, and before leaving us donated to the town all the funds for the purchase and installation of this bench swing. It's quite amazing to me to imagine someone in their most difficult moments thinking about leaving something to our small community. But this is a type of person Petra was. Those of us who knew her miss her constant kindness of spirit. But all of us have a reminder of it in the bench swing she donated. Thank you, Petra, for your time with us. Earlier that year, in May of 2022, a new historical marker was also installed in Rivermill Park, again at no cost to the town. This marker was installed by the Peyton Society of Virginia and describes how Valentine Peyton built a second tobacco warehouse on the Occoquan River in 1736, the first on the south side of the river, and the one that ultimately gave rise to the town of Occoquan, when Peyton's heirs eventually sold the warehouses to John Ballandine, the individual who constructed Rockledge. Also in May of 2022, the Occoquan Police Department was presented with the Agency Trilogy Award. This award is presented to law enforcement agencies whose entire command staff have completed the FBI LEEDA Trilogy Leadership Series, which includes the FBI LEDA's Supervisor Leadership Institute, Command Leadership Institute, and Executive Leadership Institute. Occoquan's Chief Lynn, Deputy Chief Foreman, and Sergeant Jackson had all completed the Leadership Series. Tune into future episodes to learn the backstory on other activities in Occoquan from the more recent past. When you walk into the Occoquan Historical Society's Millhouse Museum, almost directly across from you in an alcove, you'll see the following quote: "Yet no place can be more romantic than the view of Occoquan to a stranger, after crossing the rustic bridge which has been constructed by the inhabitants across the stream. He contemplates a river urging its course along the mountains that lose themselves among the clouds. He beholds vessels taking on board flour under the foam of the mills, and others deeply laden expanding their sails to the breeze, while every face wears contentment, every gale wafts health, an echo from the rocks multiplies the voices of the wagoneers calling to their teams." These words were written by the English novelist John Davis in his work Travels of 4 Years and a Half in the United States of America, which he dedicated to Thomas Jefferson and published in London in 1803. Davis came to America in late 1797, arriving in New York with the desire to set himself up as a private tutor for a family. Before eventually coming to Occoquan in 1801, he traveled up and down the East Coast a number of times, translating and writing, becoming friends with Aaron Burr, attending the presidential inauguration of Thomas Jefferson, and writing about how strongly he detested the institution of slavery that he witnessed in the South. In the summer of 1801, Davis had gone to Washington, believing that through the intercession of Aaron Burr, he was to receive a diplomatic position in the Department of the Treasury. It was not to be, however, the supposed job offer apparently based on a misunderstanding. A dejected Davis thus soon found himself in the middle of July in an excessively hot Alexandria, Virginia. There he put an advertisement in the Gazette, and within a few weeks a Quaker gentleman approached him about a job tutoring the children of a Quaker named Nathaniel Ellicott along the banks of the Occoquan. During this entreaty, the gentleman, according to Davis, quote, lavished his eloquence on the romantic beauties of the river Occoquan and the stupendous mountains that nodded over its banks. End quote. Accepting the invitation, Davis left Alexandria for Occoquan, where Ellicott engaged him to educate his children for a quarter of a year in reading, writing, and arithmetic, but thought French and Latin an abuse of time, and asked Davis, quote, not to say another word about it. End quote. Davis described his introduction to Occoquan thus: on crossing a little bridge, I came within view of the settlement, which is romantic beyond conception. A beautiful river rolls its stream along the mountains that rise abruptly from its bank, while on the opposite rocky shore, which appears to have been formed by a volcano, are seen 2 mills enveloped in foam, and here and there a dwelling which has vast masses of stone for its foundation. The eye for some time is arrested by the uncommon scene, but it is soon relieved by a beautiful landscape that bounds the horizon. In a word, all the riches of nature are brought together in this spot, but without confusion. That quotation and the one with which I opened this segment are the 2 most used Davis quotes in Occoquan promotional literature. And in fact, in multiple places in his work, beyond just these 2 instances, Davis extolled the natural beauty of the area. He even wrote 2 odes about it entitled Evening at Occoquan and Morning at Occoquan. Yet Davis's view of the then settlement, its people, and his time here was not always as flattering as these references might lead one to believe. Though he initially appeared to think well of Ellicott, Davis noted the failed vision of his employer, writing that due to the richness of the adjacent country and the healthfulness of the climate, the proprietor had been induced to project the plan of a city, but his visions were never realized, and Occoquan consists of only a house built on a rock, 3 others on the riverside, and a half a dozen log huts scattered at some distance. Occoquan, he noted, scarcely supplied more literature than Ovid's Place of Banishment on the Black Sea. And it was friendship with a Frenchman near Fauquier Courthouse that cheered, quote, the gloom of his solitude at Occoquan, end quote. To alleviate this gloom, Davis also rode to Alexandria every Saturday, visited what he considered to be an excellent tavern by the bridge that crossed the Occoquan near its mouth at the Potomac, and wrote letters, in one instance, quote, execrating the honey promises of the great men of power who had doomed him to the obscurity of Occoquan, end quote. But it was the people of the area and his pupils that generated Davis's most unflattering descriptions of Occoquan. They possessed more, quote, curiosity than breeding, end quote, he remarked when they assembled around a party of Indians who had turned from the road to visit a grave on the north bank of the river. After 3 months at Occoquan, Davis had had his fill of the people and his pupils. He was, he wrote, quote, surrounded by a throng of oafs who read their lessons with the same tone that Punch makes when he squeaks through a comb, end quote. Punch at the time was a popular English puppet show character. 3 months later, Davis held even Ellicott in lower estimation. Upon informing Ellicott of his resignation, Ellicott chose as Davis's replacement, quote, an old drunken Irishman of the name Burbage, end quote, who, according to Davis, was so drunk that he could with difficulty stand on his legs when addressing Ellicott. Davis alleges that he protested to the Quaker that it was improper to employ such a person to educate his children, to which Ellicott allegedly responded, quote, friend, of all the schoolmaster I ever employed, none taught my children to write so good a hand as a man who was constantly in a state that bordered on intoxication. They learned more of him in 1 month than of any other in a quarter, end quote. It was not without some melancholy that John Davis left Occoquan, but one can easily imagine him saying to a tavern acquaintance some years later, Occoquan? Yes, I know it. I spent 3 months there one night. If you're interested in John Davis's work, it's in the public domain and available online for viewing or downloading for free. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. I encourage everyone who is interested in learning more about Occoquan history to visit Occoquan's Millhouse Museum and consider joining the Occoquan Historical Society. You can find more information at www.occoquanhistoricalsociety.org. That's the intro sound for our Rumor Mill Shredder segment. This is where we pay homage to the fact that while for much of its history Occoquan was a prosperous mill town, the only mill in operation today is the rumor mill. Here we take on urban legends, myths, rumors, or other similar topics that need straightening out. This episode's topic is a little different, but like last week is again related to the history segment you just heard. Occoquan has had 3 schools in its history, which perhaps we will talk about in a future episode, with the first considered to be the one in which John Davis taught. Some assume that he taught at Rockledge, where Ellicott lived. Davis's account, however, reveals that this was not the case. The schoolhouse in which Davis taught was apparently also where he lived. The schoolhouse at Occoquan, he writes, quote, was entirely my own. It was a little brick structure situated about 300 yards from the house on the rock. The front casements looked upon the Occoquan River and commanded the variegated prospect of hill and dale. It is so seldom an author gets a house, he continues, that it should excite no wonder if he loves to describe it. End quote. At which point, Davis comments on the house descriptions of the ancient Roman Pliny the Elder and the English poet Alexander Pope. Unlike them, Davis does not tell us more about his schoolhouse, but instead remarks, quote, I mingled seldom with the people of Occoquan, but, shut up in my profound habitation, sought an oblivion of care in writing, reading, and tobacco. Often when the moonlight slept upon the mountain near my dwelling, have I walked before my door and gazed in silent rapture on the orb of night. As always, we'll wrap up by talking about upcoming events in town. Unfortunately, the town's rescheduled Firelight Night of March 14th has been canceled. If you're looking for St. Patrick's Day themed fun, however, the Mill Street Draft Garden in Occoquan will be hosting a St. Patty's Day party on Saturday, March 15th from noon to closing time. In the meantime, other town businesses are hosting a number of events between now and then. These include on March 4th the Loft Gallery exhibit of versatile landscape paintings by featured artist Rich Moore, the revealing of Hello Jackson Home Fragrance's Spring Scent collection on March 6th, a Sip and Paint event at Vizia Art Gallery on March 7th, a fantasy art show at the Art a la Carte Gallery on March 8th, several terrarium, candlemaking, and houseplant classes at Leaf and Moss on the 8th, and another event at Earth Addictions. For more information on these and other activities in Occoquan, go to www.visitoccoquanva.com/events. Again, that's www.visitoccoquanva.com/events. That brings us to the end of this episode of the Occoquan Radio Podcast. Before we go, I'd like to wish a happy birthday to my friend and neighbor William, who turned 4 last week, and has promptly insisted to me that he is now 4.5. Happy birthday, William, regardless of how old you are. Make sure you don't miss an episode of the Occoquan Radio Podcast by searching for us on the podcasting platform of your choice and hitting the subscribe button. I'm your host, Ernie Porta. Thank you for listening.